webinar this evening. We're delighted to welcome Professor Francis Kowsky this evening to talk about his brand new book, Hell on Color, Sweet on Song, Jacob Wrey Mould and the Artful Beauty of Central Park, published by Fordham University Press and co-authored with Lucille Gordon, who sadly died in 2021 before the book was finished. Professor Kowsky is SUNY Distinguished Professor Emeritus and Fellow of the Society of Architectural Historians. His body of work includes several books and articles, many of them on the early history of the American park movement, and he's the leading authority also on Calvert Vaux, especially. Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know about the format for the presentation this evening. This webinar is being recorded, and the audience is going to be on mute throughout. And then after Professor Kowsky's talk, we'll have some time, about 15 minutes, to take questions from the audience. So please enter all your questions in the chat function, and I'm going to read them out to Professor Kowsky after he's finished. I've entered a link in the chat for all of you who are interested in buying a copy of the book, and this includes a special discount code from the publisher. And yes, and I think that's all. And I think we're ready to begin whenever you are, Professor Kowsky. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to talk about Central Park and one of the early creators of the park, Jacob Wrey Mould. And the title of the book, Hell on Color, Sweet on Song, tries to cover two aspects of his career that were very important. And I'll explain that a little bit further, but also the artful beauty of Central Park. It's because he was the person who furnished the decorative elements in the park that still exist, most of them. And he had a great reputation both as an architect and a designer of ornament and books. But anyway, I'd start with this slide here, because most people probably don't know his name or know why he was important. But in 1869, the first book written about Central Park was published by Clarence Cook. He was the art critic for the Tribune. And he credited three people with the creation of Central Park: Frederick Law Olmsted, Calvert Vaux, and Jacob Wrey Mould. And in the original edition of the book, there's this beautiful monogram on the cover, and he has the monograms of Central Park here, but Frederick Law Olmsted, Calvert Vaux, and Jacob Wrey Mould here. And so these are the three people that were credited at the beginning. Now, of course, everybody knows Olmsted, and they kind of forgot Vaux, but he's come back into the picture. But Mould is really out there in the shadows, I think. So I'm hoping this book will bring him back to it. Well, there are very few pictures of Mould. This is one of the few. In fact, it was in Clarence Cook's book. Before I begin, however, I'd like to say a little word about my colleague who departed in 2021, Lucille Gordon. And it's really because of her that this book was written. Lucille, when she retired from publishing, she became a docent at Central Park. This is about 25 years ago. And she became very fascinated by Mould and the work that she saw in Central Park, and decided that she would make it her project to write a biography of this man, about whom not much was known. And she undertook a great deal of research and travels. And over the years, we'd talk about her work, and I would send her stuff when I found something that I thought was interesting. But then one day her daughter wrote to me and said that her mother was now unable to carry on her work. She was in a nursing home, and would I like to have her notes? And I said, well, I didn't have any intention of doing anything with them, but I didn't want to see them thrown away, because I knew for years that she collected a great deal of information. So I took them, And then the pandemic came along, and here were these two boxes of notes sitting in my study, and I wasn't going anywhere, and my wife wasn't well either, so I was really going to be at home. And I thought, well, you know, why not? There's a book sitting there, and Lucille had started it, and I could supplement a great deal of it with searching on the internet these days. So I decided I would write the book. Now, it's not the book that Lucille had in mind. She was intending to write a biography. Mine is more focused on his work as a designer and architect. But the book could not be written without Lucille's work, especially the biographical background that she discovered on this fascinating individual. And indeed, he had two parts of his career, and that's why the title reads Hell on Color, and the second part is Sweet on Song. He was an architect. He was trained architect in England. He would come to America in 1852. But even before he arrived in New York, he was involved with music in a very serious way. And he became a well-known translator of opera librettos from German, French, and Italian into English. And the first one that Lucille was able to discover was the translation of the Free Shooter or De Freischütz by Weber. And he would, this was one of his favorite works, it turns out. And it was first published in London, and then there'd be editions in America. He was also the translator of the songs of Jenny Lind, who was the greatest singer of her day, and you probably knew her, not quite sure, but it seems like it, that in her sheet music, his name appears very prominently here as the translator of the lyrics to her work. And throughout his life in New York, he would be important in the scene, in the music scene, in encouraging serious music and serious musicians. He himself was apparently an accomplished organist, and he would play sometimes in the churches that he had actually designed. Well, the story of his life begins back in his ancestry in England, in the Cotswold district, a little town called Ebrington, where his great-great-grandfather was a minister, an Anglican minister, and one of his sons, also Jacob Mould, left England and became, by various ways, the director of the infamous Cape Castle on the Gold Coast, or in Ghana today. And he was the governor, as it was called then, of the place where the slaves were being sent to mostly to the West Indies. And this Jacob Mould, the architect's grandfather, married a woman who was, as they said then, a mulatto, and they had at least one child, and the son was another Jacob Mould, and this became the father to the architect. And this Jacob Mould grew up in England. His father had sent him back to England to become a lawyer or an attorney, and he eventually married a woman, Mary Ann Oakley, who would be the mother of the architect Jacob Mould. So we know now that, thanks to Lucille, that there was black blood in the veins of Jacob Wrey Mould, and he tended to use his middle name more than Jacob, even in England and especially in America. Well, Mary Ann Oakley came from a very artistic family. Her uncle was an accomplished portraitist, Octavius Oakley, and this is his portrait of her. They also had connections with New York. Her family was involved in the wool trade, and they had moved their operations from England to New York City. And so there was a connection with New York, although Jacob Wrey Mould grew up in London. His mother, I think, was probably the formative influence on him, because she was interested not only in the visual arts, but in music, and apparently was a very accomplished pianist. Well, Jacob Mould grew up at the time when architecture was very important in England, and especially in London, and the Houses of Parliament were going up at this time. It's nice to think that maybe seeing that enormous construction might have influenced his ideas about becoming an architect. He did attend King's College and became trained as an architect there, and then joined the office of a very well-known designer and publisher of books about architecture, Owen Jones. And Owen Jones, like Jacob Wrey Mould's mother, was very interested in music and the arts in general, performing arts, and especially in the decorative arts and in ornament. And he had a grand reputation, more for his books really than any of the buildings that he designed, which weren't too many. And while Jacob Wrey Mould was in Owen Jones' studio and soon became his chief assistant and even his young friend, Owen Jones published very famous work on the Alhambra in Spain. In fact, he had spent a couple of years there studying this great building and especially its rich ornamentation, its Islamic tradition. And this book of several volumes was being printed, and he invented a system of printing in color while Jacob Wrey Mould was working with him. And so he probably had some role in that book that every architect in the 19th century would have been aware of. But even more famous than that was a book of ornament that even today is used by designers as a source book for decorative features called the Grammar of Ornament. And it has pages and pages of ornament from different artistic traditions, not only the Middle Ages in the West, but Islamic and Far Eastern. It's just a wonderful compendium, beautifully done, as you can see this one page here. And this was the heritage of Jacob Wrey Mould. In fact, sometimes he was referred to after he came to New York as the American Owen Jones, because he brought this tradition of decorative arts and ornament to America. Well, Owen Jones' greatest claim to fame as public work was the decorative scheme, the color scheme for the World's Fair of 1851, the first World's Fair, its so-called Great Exhibition that was held in London, and the year before Jacob Wrey Mould would have left. And in fact, he may have had some role in assisting Owen Jones in this great decorative scheme. It was, the building itself was glass and metal, but then it was painted in the color scheme that Owen Jones had designed. And at this time, while he is working with Owen Jones, he just met a young woman in one of the theaters or opera houses in London, and he soon fell in love. And this is probably 1851, early 1852. And he marries very quickly, and it turns out very badly. The day or two after he's married, her sister appears at the door with a little girl in tow, a 2-year-old child, and she tells Jacob Wrey Mould, "This is your wife's daughter." And he'd never heard anything about this before, that she wasn't married before, was probably an illegitimate child. But he was stuck, because in British law at the time, the only real grounds for divorce were adultery. And she hadn't committed adultery because the child was 2 years old. It was long before they had gotten married. And the marriage turns very sour. There's a lot of anguish and anger and mistrust. And eventually, not too long after the discovery of the child, Jacob Wrey Mould and his mother leave England. They just leave behind, they depart, and they move to New York in 1852, where, as I said, she had some relatives who were very comfortably off. They weren't poor immigrants. They had this wool trade business in New York, and they helped establish Jacob Mould in the New World and gave him a great deal of financial assistance. And because of their connections with the Society of New York. I think they helped ease him as an architect into the profession. And he gets his first big opportunity to design a church for one of the more important Unitarian ministers at the time, Henry Bellows, the All Saints Unitarian Church, which went up on 20th Street and 4th Avenue or Central Park South, near Gramercy Park. And it was a very important parish, as among its members were William Cullen Bryan and Peter Cooper. And this church was the first great example of high Victorian colorism in American architecture. And this is where he brings this other term that we used for the title of the book, hell on color. That was his words. He said, "I'm hell on color." As an architect, the church was made of red brick and white or cream colored stone in alternating courses, amongst other things, mosaics in the dome and stained glass in the windows. It got the nickname, because of the striping or the banding, the Church of the Holy Zebra. And it was just so shocking to people that this building here was so brilliant and so colorful. And it really redirected the course of high Victorian architecture in America. It had a great influence, not so many imitators, but a great influence on the use of color in architecture. And it was a magnificent structure and very important, and in a fine location, so it really drew a lot of attention. And it was based more on Southern European models. It looked very Italian, which was also something new. Most architecture of churches at the time was based on English medieval or French medieval design. But this was something now that was warm and vibrant, and it was extremely important for the future of American design. Unfortunately, like his connection to Central Park, it got forgotten because the church burned in 1931, I believe it was, after it had been abandoned. The parish had moved on uptown, and fire destroyed this magnificent structure. And it just was not, it was sort of at the time when American architectural history was beginning to be written, and since it wasn't there anymore, it just kind of got lost in the shuffle of history, although it's been now reinstated in its significant position. Well, at that time, and shortly thereafter, the church opened, 1856, the agitation to create Central Park has begun. And thanks to Calvert Vaux, the city announces a competition for the design of the landscape. And he asks Frederick Law Olmsted to join him in the preparation of an entry, the so-called greensward plan, in the competition. And they also ask Jacob Mould to come along and help them. But he says, "No, I don't think so. You're not going to win. It's all political, and you just, even though you might make the best design, you will not be chosen." Well, when they are chosen, he decides, well, maybe I should come along and work with them. And so he does. And he becomes especially close with Calvert Vaux. Vaux is largely responsible for the architectural elements in the park. And Mould adds to Vaux's designs the embellishment of decorative elements. And the most important part is the Bethesda Terrace, or simply the terrace as it was called back then, where Mould really lavishes his genius as a decorator. The terrace is at the end of the mall, and it kind of is the transition between the more formal part of the park and the more natural or wild area, the ramble and the rest of the park. So as you come down from the mall, down these great staircases to the level of the lake, you are entertained, so to speak, by the decorative elements that flourish along the walls and the staircases. And these are all Jacob Mould's contributions. The theme of the decoration is the 4 seasons. So each area, each part of the terrace is dedicated to one of the 4 seasons. And there's a lot of ornament along the railings, on the pillars down here, and up on the viewing platform here. And here's one of the few photographs we have of Mould standing next to one of the pillars at the base of the terrace. And he's looking very proud, obviously, of his work. It's freshly carved. He didn't do the carving, he made the designs, and then professional sculptors interpreted or carved them in in stone. This is an interesting photo too, because it shows us something we've learned about him as a person. He loved fine clothes. He was something of a dandy, and here he is, certainly well dressed and looking very proud of himself. And in fact, his taste for clothing got him into trouble. He could not pay his bills. At least twice he declared bankruptcy, and a lot of it had to do with his haberdasher bills. But anyways, looking very, very dapper here, and very proud, as he should have been, of his work. That's still there in Central Park today. The Conservancy has done a great job of restoring and maintaining these decorative elements along the pillars that have to do with the seasons. And they're just these delightful little vignettes framed by medieval trefoils, the kind of thing you'd find on the side of a medieval cathedral. And they celebrate the seasons. The most famous popular one is autumn here, the witch on her broomstick. But they're all delightful. They're all meant to enhance not only the beauty of the park, but the pleasure one takes in coming close to nature in the city. And he also designed these beautiful flower pots and other incidental features I'll show you in a few minutes here that were throughout the park. But the most lavish decorative elements are these panels here that celebrate the four seasons in an extraordinary, rich way. This is summer, I believe, as you come down the steps. And these are, again, his designs and look very much like Art Nouveau. And I think they were inspired by passages in Darwin's books, because he writes something about that's very similar to these kinds of designs. And I think Mould was inspired. But anyway, they're magnificent things that they just suggest the fertility of the natural world. But that's not all. When you go down beneath the terrace, the Bethesda Terrace, so you don't have to go across the 72nd Street transverse road. And this idea of the so-called separation of ways was one of the great elements of the park that Olmsted and Vaux introduced. So as you descend, instead of just making a dreary underpass here, Mould exercised his genius, if you will, as a colorist, and added underneath in the so-called arcade this great ceiling of tile that was the first time that anybody had used tile on the ceiling, and he invented a system that would maintain that. The tiles were cast in England and then sent back to America. And along the walls, he made designs for inlaid designs in different colors. Now, these are imitations today, and they're based on the many drawings that exist in the municipal archives. And this is one of them for the sides of the arcade. Mould also had a reputation amongst architects as being the premier artist, the artist who could make the most beautiful drawings. And indeed, no one in America had seen this kind of fine draftsmanship until Mould comes along, and again brings with him this wonderful tradition that he must have learned from Owen Jones. And there are many, many drawings that are preserved in the municipal archives of the artful decoration that he added to Central Park. In fact, it's the largest collection that we have of Mould drawings that are in the municipal archives. He also was a great designer of fountains, and this was something new in New York City, the monumental fountain. And when Emmett Stebbins' statue of the Bethesda Angel was installed in what had been the great circular basin in the park, at the base of the Bethesda Terrace. In fact, gives its name today to the terrace. Mould was commissioned to create the pedestal, which is a giant fountain over, and the statue pedestal rises from that. And people tend to overlook this, but this is one of the grand pieces of fountain design in New York City. Up to the time, it was the first really large decorative fountain, as opposed to something that would be more utilitarian. One large piece of granite, and it's based upon the kinds of fountains that you'd find published in the book on the Alhambra. In the Alhambra itself, there are these fountains that are very rich and decorative, and they're held up by seemingly very light elements here. So this is all inspired in great part by the Alhambra. Well, in addition to that, Mould was a great fan, as I said, of music, and he sponsors the first musical concerts in Central Park. And he actually sometimes would conduct the band that would play in the bandstand that he designed. This little one here. It's no longer standing, unfortunately, but here's a historic photograph where they're actually completing it. It was made of iron and stone, and highly colorful, and it looked as if it were being the curtains fluttering in the wind that went along so beautifully with the idea of music. And the concerts, of course, became very, very popular. And Mould is the first person to introduce music to Central Park. He also did some of the structures that still exist in the park. The most famous is the sheepfold, or along the Tavern on the Green. But you can see again his love for color and mixed materials and decorative elements that just are so rich and pleasing even to the eyes of the 21st century. He was also commissioned to design a number of incidental features that added a sense of charm and beauty to the park. Fountains, drinking fountains. There's two examples here that don't exist anymore, but these are drawings. This is a drawing in the Municipal Archives with little cups on chains, so that you would be able to get the water here in the middle, and one here that also that had the fountain was shaded in summer under this little hood. Bird houses too. They wanted to have Central Park become full of birds, and some of these birds were going to be exotic and couldn't just be allowed to run free or fly free. So he designed these bird cages that would be for more exotic birds. And what was exotic at the time were sparrows. And throughout the park, Mould designed these very rustic looking sparrow nests or birdhouses. And Clarence Cook in particular was very charmed with these and wrote somewhat extensively about them in his book on Central Park, where that picture comes from. As I mentioned, he was close to Calvert Vaux in adding decorative elements to Vaux's works. And again, one of the great features of the park was the fact that you wouldn't have to cross a carriage road or a bridle path as you were strolling. So there's the so-called separation of ways. So here at the Playmates Arch, people can walk underneath the carriage drive up here and not have to worry about being run over by a carriage. But in this particular instance, I think Vaux was tipping his hat to the great All Souls Unitarian Church, because it repeats the same color pattern that was on the church, which is long gone, but there's a kind of reminiscence of his friend's great contribution. Well, Mould works for Central Park for a decade and a half and more. And in 1874, there is a financial crisis and the parks have to lay off people. And one of them is Jacob Mould. And he's very upset by this, as are many people in New York, because he's been so important in creating the park. And there's even a great discussion of this in the newspapers, that he has to be let go. Well, one of the people that reads about his demise is a very interesting person, Henry Meigs, who was called the Yankee Pizarro down in Lima, Peru. And in Lima, Meigs had moved to South America from San Francisco in the 1850s, and he became the great entrepreneur creating the Trans-Andean Railway. And he lives in Lima. He reads about Mould not having a job, and he writes to him and says, he invites him to come to Lima, Peru, and make Lima the cosmopolitan center of South America. He wanted it to be the equal to Paris and London. It wasn't at the time. And Meigs is one of these kind of Gilded Age moguls. He has a very colorful career, lots of money, and he sort of runs Peru, at least Lima. And at age 55, Jacob Mould picks up stakes, and he moves to Peru. He moves to Lima. And in Lima, as I say, he is the protege of Henry Meigs. This is one of the images of the railway that he designed across the Andes. It was sometimes called the Railway of the Clouds. And in fact, when Mould is first there, the first couple of days, he takes him on a ride, he and his wife, up through the railroad, and they're deeply and very impressed by all of this. But his work is to make Lima a more cosmopolitan city. And one of the largest buildings in the city that in the 19th century was the home of one of the bankers who was bankrolling Henry Meigs in his work, an American named Dubois. He marries a woman from Lima, and they commissioned Mould in 1875-76 to design their palazzo, or their mansion. And it's still there today, not too well cared for, but it's there. And you can see how it is very reflective of the kind of architecture, the colorful architecture that he practiced in New York. And in particular, this is a drawing in the municipal archives for the Museum of Natural History, which he was working on before he left for Lima. And some of the elements, certainly these banded arches, appear again here in this building. He stays in Lima, but unfortunately, Henry Meigs dies in 1877, just a couple of years after Mould is there. And eventually, all of the plans for Lima as a cosmopolitan city fall apart. And in 1879, Mould returns to New York City. At this point, however, American architecture has kind of moved on. H.H. Richardson is in ascendance. The neoclassicism is on the rise. It's sort of the dominant style. And he doesn't fit in very well. He has a hard time getting back into the swing of things, you might say. And he does go back to Central Park. They hire him back to be a designer. And he works there, thanks in large part to Andrew Green, if you're familiar with that important figure in New York City in 19th century history. But so he's in New York. He's trying to get back into the field. He's remarried. He has a second wife. There's a story, quite a complicated story about his extricating himself from his first marriage. You can read about it in the book. And one of the people he certainly came to know in his return, after his return, is Violet Oakley, who was part of the Oakley family that had been very supportive of Mould. And she was born in 1874. She was about 12 years old or so, and she did seem to remember there's some things in her writings about he would have been, I guess, her great uncle in some way. And Violet Oakley is one of the first important women muralists in America. She's very famous for the murals she did in the Capitol in Harrisburg, in Pennsylvania. And a very talented and very clever artist, very beautiful painter. And later on in her career, long after Mould had died, she did some things that, in my opinion, suggest that she was aware of her ancestors' heritage and work. This is a panel painting that she did called The Great Wonder. And it's two doors that are closed like a medieval diptych, and then they open up and the painting is inside. But certainly there's something here that's very close in feeling and in appearance to what Mould did both in Central Park and elsewhere. And I'd like to think that Violet had some influence from Jacob Mould. Well, there are some works outside of New York that he did that still survive, but Central Park is really the place where most of his contributions still exist. But in upstate New York, in the Finger Lakes region, while he was in Peru, he was sending back drawings for the First Presbyterian Church in Bath. And indeed, this is probably the most complete and finest surviving piece of architecture by Jacob Mould. The church is beautifully maintained, and he was able to design a tower of a type that he had hoped would be built at All Souls, but it never was. And it's a landmark in the town of Bath. But and inside he decorated it in mosaics and color, a very beautiful color scheme, some of which was lost when the Tiffany's came along in the 20th century and redesigned it. But the exterior is really as Mould had planned it. And he got to see it when he came back from Peru, because he worked for a family that in Bath that were the Davenports, that had paid mostly for the church, and asked him to design some other buildings in Bath. Another church design that he built was in the far north of New York, near where the Hudson River begins, at Lucerne. It's sort of made people think of Switzerland. And the summer community there, again, the Oakleys had a summer home in the area, and I have a feeling that's why he was going there. But he designed this beautiful little chapel or summer church. Well, it's all year round, but it was mostly used in the summer by summer guests, mostly from New York City and Brooklyn. And it's still there today, a beautiful little sort of rustic chapel. Here, the color is not so important as the variety of shapes and forms, a kind of picturesque volumes that also were characteristic of Mould's architecture. The very last important work that he was associated with is back in the city. Morningside Park had been originally designed by Olmsted and Vaux in the early 1870s, but not much had been done to finish it. And then in the early 1880s, they were brought back to work on the grounds, but Mould was involved with developing these enormous walls that shore up Morningside Avenue on the western side of the park, because the park is, if you're familiar with it, it's very low. It's down below the level of the rest of that area where St. John the Divine is, and this whole part of the city, which was being developed in the early 1880s. But these rampart walls, which were designed by Vaux, along with some sort of viewing platforms that come out into the landscape, and staircases that allow you to walk from Morningside Avenue down into the park or the other way up. And here's an early postcard view with the ramparts here. These were remarkable pieces of urban design, and again, not too well known as works by Mould or even appreciated, but at the time, they were compared to similar terraces that had been built in Paris and in Florence. There was a new pleasure that people were taking, not only in viewing natural scenery, but in viewing city scenery, vistas of urban vistas. And the great one, of course, was in front of the Church of the Sacre-Cœur in Paris, the Montmartre Terrace, which allowed people today stand and view the great city below. And in Florence, the Piazzale Michelangelo does the same thing on the other side of the Arno. You have this high point of view and with a panorama of the city. Well, that was the inspiration for what Mould said he did here in Morningside Park. And indeed, you have not only a view of the park below, but the city beyond, and then you can see on a good day Long Island Sound. So it's really a very wonderful piece of urbanism here, urban design, that was finished after his death, but it's really largely his contribution to the last important park that Olmsted and Vaux would be involved with in New York. Well, he dies in 1886. Apparently, he wasn't in good health much of his life. Lucille Gordon found references to him being sick and being away from work a number of times. He dies of a heart attack at his home, which is still standing at 123 East 26th Street. And it's in the early summer of 1886. And he's mourned by the architectural profession. The funeral takes place at his home, and also by the musical world. And one of the great rising stars of opera in New York at the time was a young woman named Zélie de Lucerne, and she sent a big bouquet of flowers to Mould's home, to his coffin there in his home. And so we can be fairly sure that he was sponsoring her, helping her to get her career started. And she became quite well known as an opera singer in the early 20th century. And there are even some early recordings of her. And I like to think that maybe this was some of the last music that Mould had heard. And maybe not maybe, but she sang some of the translations, librettos that Mould had done. At the time of his death, he was working on a translation of Tannhäuser that would be finished by someone else afterwards, but he'd been commissioned to do that. So throughout his life, he kept his fingers, kept his hands on the pulse of music in New York City. Well, he was buried in the Oakley family plot in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. This is a view of his gravestone. He was, as I said, he'd married again. Lucille and I were never able to find out what happened to his widow. A few years after his death, she sold the house that was at 123 East 26th Street. And there's a reference to a woman with her name sailing to Paris or sailing to France a short time after that. But whether it's she or somebody that just simply had the same name, we don't know. And she disappeared. She's not buried with him. And there's something curious about his gravestone. If you're familiar with England, he was born in London in 1825 at a suburb of the city called Chislehurst. Well, here's something cast in stone that is a mistake. It's misspelled. It should have been S-L-E. So the tombstone obviously we put up later. I don't know quite when, but whoever carved it carved the wrong name and misspelled the place. I think he probably would have gotten a kick out of that. The little tile in the foreground here was placed there by the man who was responsible for the restoration of the tile work in Central Park. He owned the Minton Tile Factory in England, and he came to New York on many occasions, and he made a little pilgrimage one afternoon to Greenwood, and he laid this tile. That's actually one of the originals at the foot of the grave here. So that's my story of Jacob Wrey Mould. I think there's still a biography that could be written about him. There are many aspects of his life that are very interesting. He was lamented at the time of his death as not having been, he was as creative as any architect in America, and it was compared to H.H. Richardson, who died the same year. But people said he just didn't have the business sense to create a studio or a business that would have the kind of impact that his creativity deserved. But anyway, when you're in Central Park, have a look and tip your hat to Jacob Wrey Mould. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kowsky, for that fascinating lecture. We have a few questions. I'm going to start with Sam White, who asked, actually towards the end of your lecture, so this is, so Sam White asked, Mould's gravestone in Greenwood is counterintuitively plain, really plain. Is there a backstory about it?
I don't know. I asked one of the people that's involved in the history of Greenwood if they could find the records of when the stone was placed there and who might have paid for it or had it carved. And they said they would look into the archives. It's very difficult, apparently, to find this information. So I really can't say, but obviously it comes much later than 1886.
And then there's a comment about the Minton tile there. Hannah Marks says the Zebra Church has not been forgotten by the Unitarians in New York City. The tiles were or are Minton. And then we've got another question from Jeremy Woodoff. There were similar buildings and features in Prospect Park, but I understand Mould was not involved there. Do you know whether he had a direct influence on Prospect Park?
No, that was the work of another English immigrant architect, Thomas Wiesdell. And he came in 1868. Vaux had gone to Europe and to England, and they found Wiesdell and convinced him to come. And Wiesdell especially worked with Olmsted, but I think he died in 1884, and there's a letter that Mould writes to Olmsted shortly after that and saying, you know, I'm available. I know Wiesdell died, and I think he had tuberculosis, way too young, and sort of asking him, you know, if you want me to do the work that he did, I will. But Olmsted doesn't take him up on it, as far as I can tell. And so the work in Prospect Park is by Thomas Wiesdell, as well as the ornament around the Capitol in Washington. Olmsted designed the work, the grounds there.
Right. And then another question about his work in Central Park. Brad Vogel says, I had understood that Mould also designed the fabulous Egyptian revival railings around Cleopatra's Needle in Central Park.
I believe that's true. There are drawings, and I think there are drawings in the municipal archives. And a lot of the railings on the bridges that Vaux designed were by Mould. And in fact, there's a certain pattern that I think it was on the, might have been the Playmates Arch, that appears on the ironwork on the house in Peru. So he was remembering and adding those touches that were, it's amazing to think people, of course, in Peru, they didn't know, but that here was something that had come to them from Central Park.
Okay, and then here's a question about his home on 26th Street. Does it reflect any of his design work inside or out?
There is inside the vestibule a tile design that we think is by Mould. It fits a description that was written of his, he did do the decorative work inside his house. It was not built by him, but he bought it and he added some color scheme. The colors are gone, but this tile in the vestibule is there. And we think that it's very much in his style, and probably is his. I had a friend here in Buffalo whose cousin owned that house for a while. That's why I know about this.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
And then what was the headline, Martha Fleischman asks, what was the headline in French, maybe, in the newspaper that Mould was holding up in that dashing photograph on Bethesda Terrace?
It's very difficult to tell. It is a French news. It was a French, not a French newspaper. It was an American French newspaper. Le Figaro something. And the picture was taken by a French photographer, Provost, who was living in New York. But you can't really tell what it's saying. We tried. It's a very good negative. It's in or print. It's in the Eastman House in Rochester. And you can tell the name of the newspaper, but not much else. And it was taken in September of 1862. I even think the date is there, but it's very intriguing. I think maybe the photographer asked him to hold that paper up, but I was hoping that if you could find out what the date was, there might have been an article about Central Park, but so far can't.
It's absolutely fascinating. So I think that's it for the questions that we have. Now I was particularly struck. I had no idea because I live very near Morningside Park, and I had no idea that he was responsible for the rampart. So I'm going to see that with renewed enthusiasm now.
And the staircases that take you down, and they're super. They're beautiful.
Yes, gorgeous. And I think that's it. So thank you very much again, Professor Kowsky. And as I said, I'm going to be posting the talk on the Friends website for future viewing. And yeah, lots of appreciation in the comments. So thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Fun.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.